Hello, I'm the author of Daniel11truth.com, watching God work. The purpose of this video is to explain the post-rapture timeline and dispel a false teaching. It was actually requested by email that I do this video to dispel this particular false teaching that a lot of people believe, but in doing so, I kind of have to explain almost the entire post-rapture timeline. So that's kind of how I arrived at this. But the false teaching is that many people have been led to believe that Israel must sign a peace treaty with the Antichrist. Then 3.5 years later, he deceives everyone and sets the abomination up in the third temple, which is completely false. There's nothing in the Bible to indicate that a third temple must be built before the rapture, because the abomination is not set up in the temple. And the third temple is built after the rapture, not before. So in this video, I'll prove both of these things by going through all the various verses that have the abomination mentioned, both Old Testament and New Testament, and show that the abomination is not set up in the temple. And then second of all, I'll go through all the various verses that mention a third temple in the Bible and show that it's built after the rapture, not before. So let's get started. Where does this belief come from? Well, the belief that they sign a peace treaty with the Antichrist comes from Daniel 9:27, when it says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So this is likely to be the Antichrist, because it says he will set up the abomination and the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So this is, the Antichrist, or the nation of the Antichrist. I say that because the pronoun he often refers to a nation and not just a person. If you look at Daniel 11, where it talks about the kings of the north and kings of the south, that's why I say the pronoun he sometimes refers to a nation, from knowing history in Daniel 11. But sometimes it can refer to just a person. So it could do either one. It depends on the context of the verse. And the context of this verse, it could be either one. It could be the person or the nation. Doesn't really matter. But he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. Many does not mean Israel. People have just decided that was Israel, probably because the word covenant is used. But covenant is just a agreement or promise. It's a common word. Just because the word covenant is used doesn't mean it's Israel. Has nothing to do with the Holy Covenant, which is used in Daniel 11:28 and 30, that denotes Israel. But it clearly says Holy Covenant when it wants to denote Israel, not just the common word covenant. Plus, it's definitely not the Holy Covenant, because the Holy Covenant is between God and Abraham, and this is between the Antichrist, or nation of the Antichrist, and many, which I have an idea of what that is, but for the sake of this video, I won't go into it. You can find more about Daniel 9:27 on the website, about the 70th 7 and the middle of the 70th 7. But I'm trying to keep things as quick as possible. Secondly, the abomination is set up on a wing, which is not the temple. Actually, they put "of the temple" in brackets here to denote that, I guess the words "of the temple" are not in the actual text, but they denote that that's what the wing was, a wing of the temple. But no other version puts the word temple in this verse, including King James Version, American Standard, etc. Only the New International Version, which I like the New International Version, but it's the only version that has the temple in here, which that's probably what the wing is, a wing of the Temple Mount, really. Because when you think of a wing, it's a section that is set off from the main part, like the wing of a hospital or wing of a bird. Like the wing of a hospital would be a section of buildings that were off from the main hospital that are connected by a walkway or such. Or the wing of a bird would be off from the main body of the bird, but connected by a bone or tendon. So it's a section that is connected, but it's set off. So it could be a section of the Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount is fairly large, and the section that the Dome of the Rock is on and the Al-As Mosque, that's only just one section of the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount's much bigger than people think, and there are other sections, so a wing could actually be on the Temple Mount, but just in a different section. It could also be a wing like a adjoining part of the Temple Mount, such as the Western Wall Plaza, also called the Caudal, which is on the western side of the Temple Mount. It could also be the Mount of Olives, which is on the east side of the Temple Mount, where Jesus spent a lot of time. So it could actually be anywhere in like the old city of Jerusalem, which is, the old city of Jerusalem is not very big, so it would kind of all be a wing of the temple. But here's the King James Version, just to illustrate that the temple is not used. It says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, meaning 7 years. It's the same thing. And in the midst of the week, see, they don't use the term middle, which I actually like that better, because middle, it's not an exact middle like a day in the middle. It's just an approximation of a middle. Like it could be months, difference. But they just say in the midst of the week, which would be anywhere in the middle or in anywhere within it. He shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. Oblation, I guess, means offering. Never really heard that word. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. See, I guess overspreading is their idea of setting it up. But they just say overspreading. They don't say anything about a wing or a temple. So it could be overspreading anywhere. Even until the consummation, I guess that means end. That's another word I hadn't heard of. That determines shall be poured upon the desolate. But I just wanted to illustrate that wing and temple, neither one are mentioned in this verse in the King James Version. So I don't think you can say that the abomination that causes desolation is set up in the temple based on this, especially since it's in brackets and a wing is kind of off from the main body. So it's just on a wing. But let's move on and look at some places where it's mentioned in the New Testament to see where the abomination might be set up. This is Jesus speaking. He said, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is the main place in Matthew 24 where he talks about the abomination and pointing to the book of Daniel. So that's very important. But he says standing in the holy place. But where is the holy place? In Mark, it's even more vague. It says standing where it does not belong. So that's the holy place. But Luke says when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So the desolation is obviously, the abomination that causes desolation. But the abomination could be set up, according to this, anywhere in Jerusalem. Because it says, let those in the city get out and let those in the country not enter the city. So they're talking about the city of Jerusalem. And when you consider it, that the city of Jerusalem is the holy place. So when Jesus referred to it as the holy place, it could be anywhere in Jerusalem. But particularly probably the old city of Jerusalem, because that would be the holy place. Not the modern city of Jerusalem. And the old city of Jerusalem would be more adjacent to the Temple Mount. So it would be like on a wing. So somewhere in Jerusalem. But the Bible doesn't support that the abomination is put up in the temple at all. So now let's go up to when is it set up? So we know that where it's set up, like somewhere in Jerusalem, but when? So this is the same verse, 9:27. So let's compare it to Daniel 11:31, which also talks about the abomination that causes desolation. It says, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. So these other things happen before that, but this is natural. It's talking about modern times, so it's natural that this is talking about the temple fortress. But notice that this is not a temple. Them desecrating the temple fortress is not desecrating the temple. It's the temple fortress. And in fortress, you think of walls. You know, a fort consists of walls. And this fortress is the western wall that they're talking about. Because that naturally, somebody would want to desecrate the western wall because that's where the Jews pray to on a daily basis. So if they desecrated it, it would naturally abolish the daily sacrifice because they wouldn't want to pray to a wall that had been desecrated. So it would abolish it at least for a little while until they were able to get in there and clean off whatever desecrated it and remedy the situation. So it would abolish the daily sacrifice. So in comparison, see, many people want to say that this says, like in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering. They want to say that this is an animal sacrifice, and that in order for there to be an animal sacrifice, there has to be a third temple and an altar. But that's not what it means, because it's clear from Daniel 11:31 that it's talking about the temple fortress. It's talking about the western wall and the daily prayer at the western wall. So that's what he puts an end to, at least temporarily, before they set up the abomination that causes desolation. So let's look at the other two places where the abomination is mentioned in Daniel. Because, see, there's 4 different chapters in Daniel. Chapter 8, 9, 11, and 12, where the abomination is mentioned. And you have to use all of those chapters. You can't just pick the one you want and discard all the rest because they don't suit your timeline. You got to use them all. And in Daniel 8, it is clear that the end that is decreed literally is 2,300 days. Because, see, comparing again to 9:27, it says, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Well, the end that is decreed is not just one day. I mean, God doesn't just strike him with lightning when he sets the thing up. He sets the thing up, and then the end that is decreed is actually 2,300 days. You can tell by this verse, because it says, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice and rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary, and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Well, this evening and morning is just a day, because the Israelites start their day at 6 p.m. in the evening. So evening and morning is just a day. So it's nothing fancy about that. Actually, in the King James Version, it says 2,300 days. They don't even separate it. So this is just clearly just days. Nothing fancy about that. But when he says the rebellion that causes desolation, that's obviously he's combining the two in Daniel 11:31, because it says his armed forces will rise up. So, an uprising is a rebellion. And the rebellion that causes desolation is obviously just combining the two, because the uprising happens first, and then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. So that's clearly just the rebellion that causes desolation. He's combining them. And also the daily sacrifice happens at the same time, because he's abolishing the daily sacrifice. So these first two happen at the abomination. The uprising and abomination happen at the rapture. And you can tell it happens at the rapture. You can look at a different video called End Times Explained, where I go through more of that. But this is denoted the middle, because it corresponds to the middle of the 70th 7. because some people try to say that this 70th seven is the same as tribulation, but it's not. 2300 days is tribulation, but 2300 days is not 7 years. They're different lengths of time. This is 84 months and this is 78 months. They're literally different lengths of time. You can't squeeze them together and say that one is the other, but people do that. But you also can't squeeze them together because the abomination is in the middle of one and it starts the other. So if you squeeze them together, they just don't match up. So you can't manipulate Daniel just because you want to. So this other is surrender of the sanctuary. That's actually in the middle. And we know that because the Sixth Trumpet War is when the sanctuary is surrendered. And the Sixth Trumpet War is in the middle, after the 42 months and after the 1260 days. And I'll get to the exact scriptures for those in a little bit, when the two witnesses are killed. All that happens together. And the Antichrist rises for 42 months. So all that happens during the trumpet plagues. So the trumpet plagues happen in the first 42 months here after the rapture. And the trumpet plagues can't start until after the rapture, because they can't start until after the seventh seal in Revelation 8. And the rapture is the sixth seal in Revelation 6. And then you have the multitude in heaven in Revelation 7. So everything makes perfect sense. And the trumpet plagues are after the rapture, not as post-tribs try to say. And I'll prove all that when I go through the actual scriptures. And then during this last 36 months, you have the bowl plagues, and they're much more severe than the trumpet plagues. But they happen after the surrender of the sanctuary, and then the final one is Armageddon. That's the seventh bowl, when the host will be trampled underfoot. That happens at the end here. Host just meaning many. It's the many nations of the Antichrist are trampled underfoot by Jesus when he comes back riding on his white horse in Revelation 19 and conquers them at Armageddon, which is the seventh bowl. So you have the trumpet plagues and then the bowl plagues. And that's tribulation, the 2300 days. And the false prophet performs the miracles and enacts the mark of the beast at the start, kind of at the start of the bowl plagues. Not in the first part. It'll actually be in the second part, because there's like a first half of Revelation 13 and then the second half of Revelation 13. And Daniel 12 talks a little about that. It says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up. See, that's the same two things again. There will be 1290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1335 days. So he's talking about a time from starting at the abomination. So starting at the start here, or the middle of the 70th seven actually, there will be 1290 days. So the two witnesses prophesy for 1260 days. So he's talking about something happening 30 days after the two witnesses are killed. And I suspect that will be when the false prophet enacts the mark of the beast in Israel and forces all those Israelites, because see, the sanctuary had been surrendered at that time and the two witnesses killed, so there's nothing stopping them anymore. See, they can't do it prior to that because the two witnesses would stop them. But after they're killed at day 1260, then at 1290, they enact the mark of the beast. But for the sake of the 144,000 Israelites that are sealed by God in Revelation 7, they only have to avoid the mark of the beast for 45 days until day 1335. Because blessed is he who waits for and reaches the end of the 35 days. That's, blessed if they refrain from taking the mark of the beast for that length of time, because that's when the false prophet and the armies will come in there and gather all those who did not take the mark of the beast like they were supposed to, and they will gather them up and kill them. And it talks about the 144,000 being martyred in Revelation 14 and 15. And that's before the bowl plagues in Revelation 16. So the bowl plagues will start after day 1335. So it's actually the last 33.5 months that the bowl plagues take place, which end with Armageddon. But you have to take all these verses in Daniel and put them together in a way that they make sense. And this is the only way that they make sense. It's the only possible way that you can put them all together. So you can't just take Daniel 9:27 and make up what you want it to say and discard all the rest. You can't do that. So let's move right along. I have to also go through Second Thessalonians, at least 1 through 4, because it contains the words God's temple. And I'll explain that. This actually is God's temple, but it's built after the rapture. It says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him. That's gathered to him is the rapture, gathered in the sky. That's what Paul is referring to. We ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposedly to come from us, saying the day of the Lord has already happened. So what happened is, Paul is just dispelling his own rumor. See, there's rumors and false prophecies all, even back in Paul's time. And he was trying to squash the rumor, and he does so by referring to Daniel 11, which is just what Jesus said to do in Matthew 24, which I read earlier, where it says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination called spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So it's natural that Paul would go to the book of Daniel to squash this rumor. He says, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs. See, he uses the same term that Daniel 8 used, the rebellion that causes desolation. But that's referring to what I said, it's the armed forces rising up and then setting up the abomination. So when he says the rebellion occurs, that's what he's talking about, Daniel 11:31 here. So he says that has to occur, and then the man of lawlessness will be revealed, the man doomed to destruction. That's talking about the Antichrist being revealed. It says until the end that is decreed is poured out on him, doomed to destruction. So being revealed, though, is like happens after the rapture. It says with flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. See, notice that's past tense. They violated the covenant, and that has to do with the abomination, the setting up of it. Because although no one really knows what the abomination actually is, I suspect it's just something as simple maybe as a flag that symbolizes the splitting of Jerusalem. Because God miraculously reunited Jerusalem back in 1967 in the Sixth War, when he allowed Israel to defeat several Arab nations around them and unite Jerusalem all in 6 days. So, I mean, that was obviously God. So if their armed forces rose up and set up a flag somewhere around the old city of Jerusalem, possibly on the Temple Mount, possibly around it, and signified, that they had taken back East Jerusalem or taken back the Temple Mount, then that would be an abomination to God, because abomination just means something hated by God, and God would hate the splitting of Jerusalem. Just simple as that. And that would be a violation of the covenant, like God's covenant to David, because he gave Jerusalem to David. But anyway, those who are wise will instruct many, those for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. So the Antichrist is trying to corrupt those who, invaded and set up the flag or whatever it was, and he's trying to stop anybody from telling the truth about really what happened, talking about the rapture. So he's trying to stop people from talking about the rapture happening, and just try, just like they some of them deny the Holocaust. Well, how can you deny the Holocaust? It's just a fact of history. Well, the rapture will be a fact of history after it happens, and they'll try to stop that too, by killing people. But in doing so, he'll be revealing himself. So that's what Paul is talking about. And then it says he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Like I said, this really is God's temple, but by that time, it's had time to be built, because this is years later after the rebellion, and you can tell because it perfectly matches Daniel 11:36 here, which is well after the abomination and the rapture, after he's revealed himself. It says the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. That's almost word for word with Second Thessalonians. So you can tell that this God's temple is way after the abomination. It says he will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. That's the end of the decree, the time of wrath. For what has been determined must take place. So it's talking about the 2300 days there. But in the middle of that, he sets himself up in God's temple, and God has determined that he must be successful in doing that. Not by his own power, but God is allowing him to do that, because that's what part of God's end that is decreed. He lets him set himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Does that before he's destroyed. But you can clearly see that God's temple is after. And I'll explain when it's built, but this is years after, when the two witnesses prophesy while he's killing everyone. And right after the abomination, the two witnesses appear, and they prophesy in Jerusalem and prevent people from attacking while they're building the third temple. But then when the two witnesses are done, that's when they attack, and he sets himself up in God's temple at the end after they've built it. But you can tell the abomination is not set up in the God's temple. They happen way apart compared verse 31 to 36. They're way apart. This is more post-rapture discussion, because I have to, like I say in the other illustration, there's a lot of stuff happening during the trumpet plagues. And one thing is that the beast is rising up in the first part of Revelation 13. So men worship the dragon. The dragon is Satan, because he had been given authority to the beast, and they also worship the beast and ask who is like the beast, who can make war against him. So the beast is obviously a big military power. It's actually a group of nations, because the beast has 10 horns. It's probably 10 nations at least to start with. And so they have a mighty military. So who can make war against him? And the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies. See, the mouth is actually the Antichrist. People, the Revelation actually uses beast and Antichrist interchangeably. Some it's talking about like a group of nations, and sometimes it's talking about a person of the Antichrist. But it's really, the beast is a group of nations. The Antichrist is a human being. But it says the beast was given a mouth, that's the Antichrist, to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God. See, that's the same as in Daniel 11:36, when he blasphemed God and exalted himself above God, and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. Well, this is an interesting phrase, because why would he be slandering those who live in heaven unless it was post-rapture? The rapture had already happened, and the Christians went to heaven. That's who he's slandering. Why would he, before the rapture? I don't know who they think is in heaven. They know God. They know God is in heaven. The Muslims believe in God, and they may believe that some of their martyrs have already gone to heaven and given 70 virgins or whatever. So why would he be slandering those who live in heaven if it's before the rapture? Well, it's not. It's after the rapture. And he was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. The saints are the two witnesses and the 144,000 in Israel, that he is given power to make war. So that's the same as him, God says he will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, because what has been determined must take place. So he must make war against the saints and conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So it's not just Israel, but it'll be lots of nations and lots of people. And in fact, all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. all whose names were not written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb and who was slain to the creation of the world. This is another illustration that this is after the rapture, in the post-rapture, because all inhabitants of the earth that are living on the earth at that time are the people whose names were not written in the book of life. That's true because all the people whose names were in the book of life have gone to heaven in the rapture, and they're at the wedding supper of the Lamb, enjoying a good time at the wedding supper of the Lamb while all this turmoil is happening on earth. So that's clearly post-rapture. So let's move on to the Sixth Trumpet War. This is in Daniel 11, and it matches Revelation 9, but it talks about the king of the north will storm out against the king of the south. The king of the north is, of course, Iran and all the nations that are aligned with Iran, because that's in Daniel 11:21. Iran is clearly the king of the north in end times. But he storms out against the king of the south, and in process invades the beautiful land, which is Israel. And many countries will fall. That's what it says, many nations, but especially Israel. So Egypt will not escape. And it says the Libyans and Nubians will be in submission. That's interesting because a lot of ISIS members went to Libya, but they will be in submission also. Nubians being North Africa. But the Sixth Trumpet War in Revelation 9 is interesting because notice that the first woe has passed. So the sixth angel sounds his trumpet, which starts the second woe. And I'll speak about that in a minute. But the Sixth Trumpet War starts the second woe, and it says, and the four angels who had been kept ready for this very hour, day, month, and year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of the mounted troops were 200 million. I heard their number. So by him saying I heard their number, that kind of implies to me that this is not just a symbolic number. This is a real number, 200 million troops. And that's a huge number of troops, but they got to be kind of large to kill a third of mankind. But this, this is like World War III right here. It's the Sixth Trumpet War, and there'll actually be a World War III, but it's well after the rapture. Nobody has to worry about it beforehand. But it'll kill a third of mankind. It repeats in verse 18. A third of mankind was killed by the plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur, which sulfur is just kind of like gunpowder. Fire and smoke and sulfur is like, it's guns that came out of their mouths. John is actually describing tanks, I think, but he doesn't know what a tank is. He says the power of the horses, which it's really tanks, was in their mouths because they have a huge cannon on the front of a tank, and in their tails, for their tails were like snakes having heads, which to inflict injury. See, like on a tank, not only do they have a big cannon pointing front ways, but they have a machine gun mounted on top, which they can shoot behind them. So it's like the machine gun is like a head, which inflicts injury out the back, the tail. But it says the rest of mankind that were not killed by these plagues still did not repent. So this is another case of showing that it's post-rapture, because all the rest of mankind, the 2/3 that are not killed in the Sixth Trumpet War, still do not repent of the work of their hands. They do not stop worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver, etc. They did not repent of their murders or magic arts or sexual immorality or their thefts. See, this is all the sinners who are left after the rapture. All the rest of mankind that are living on the earth at that time are the sinners who were not taken in the rapture. And even after a third of mankind is killed, they still do not repent. They're more angry than ever. Because, well, let's move on to the two witnesses, and this kind of explains why they're angry. But I have to include this. Once again, it says the temple of God. So this is important. But this is post-rapture. It says, I was given a reed and a measuring rod and told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there, but exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Well, 1260 days is 42 months. It's the same period of time. So the Gentiles will be trampling on the holy city, meaning they will flock to Jerusalem to see these 2 witnesses who are prophesying for the same length of time. And the reason Gentiles do that is because of the misconception that people can get a second chance to go to heaven after the rapture if they just don't take the mark of the beast. But that's a misconception. That doesn't apply to Gentiles. It's just, and people are going to be sorely disappointed to find out that people have misinterpreted Revelation, and Gentiles don't get a second chance. But I can show that by, let's skip down here to verse 7. Now when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack, overpower, and kill them. Talking about the 2 witnesses. Their bodies will lie in the street of the great city, figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was also crucified. Well, that's Jerusalem. It's just figuratively called Sodom and Egypt because this is post-rapture, and all the sinners are living there. But it's Jerusalem because that's where the Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, men from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because the 2 prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. So the Gentiles will be flocking to the Jerusalem for 42 months, trying to figure out how they can get to heaven still after the rapture. But see, the 2 witnesses will be telling them the truth. Prophecy means truth. And the truth is they don't get a second chance, and that's why they're tormented. The 2 witnesses will not be giving them good news. There's no good news to that, and that's why people will gloat over them and celebrate when they're killed. If the 2 witnesses were giving them good news, why would that happen? Why would they celebrate when they're killed? It's because Gentiles will be getting the bad news that they don't get a second chance. Only the 144,000 Jews, which are hand-selected by God, get a second chance to go to heaven when they're martyred. But another thing I wanted to point out was it says these men. A lot of people want to say that the 2 witnesses are symbolic of other groups, but it's mostly post-tribs who say that. But verse 6 clearly says these men. It says they have the power to shut up the sky so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying, and they have the power to turn the waters to blood and strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. That's why I say that they have the power to keep all of Israel's enemies at bay while the 3rd temple is built. Because see, it says go and measure the temple of God. I think that's like the start. It's like not the temple is sitting there, but it says go and measure. Like, first thing you do when you want to build something is that you survey, you measure. You got to make a survey and get the surveyors out there before you build. So I think that's why they use measure right there. But they build the temple while the 2 witnesses are prophesying for the 42 months. And they could build it easily, and that's 3.5 years, and they could easily build it in that period of time. And then at the end of the 42 months, though, the 2 witnesses are killed. It says, but after 3.5 days, it says when they finish their testimony, and then after they're killed, 3.5 days, the breath of life entered them, and they stood on their feet and struck terror to those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven, come up here, and they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies looked on. At that very hour there was a severe earthquake. 1/10 of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified and gave glory to God. The second woe is past. That's why I was talking about the second woe. Remember, the second woe starts at the Sixth Trumpet War. See, you can tell. And the second woe ends when the 2 witnesses go to heaven after they're killed by the beast. So the second woe consists of the Sixth Trumpet War, which is when the beast has, reached his peak. Because in Revelation 13, remember, he was given authority for 42 months. It's the same 42 months that all the rest of this is happening. And then when he's at his peak, towards the end of the 42 months, when the two witnesses are finished, that's when the beast comes and attacks and overpowers and kills them. And when the sanctuary is surrendered, which is in the middle once again. But you can tell because it all happens during the second woe. It all happens together. Revelation 9, Revelation 13, and Revelation 11 all happen during the same 42 months. And that's the 42 months that the trumpet plagues are happening. And at the end, that's when the sanctuary is surrendered and he exalts himself above God and says, and calls himself God. At the end of the Sixth Trumpet War, when they're killed, after the Antichrist is risen for 42 months. And then it's after that they set up the mark of the beast. Everything makes perfect sense when you get everything aligned with the abomination, just like Jesus said. I just wanted to go over this slide one more time. It's from a previous video, but it illustrates how post-tribs try to distort everything. But there's two groups in Revelation 7, which the two groups, one group is the Christians in heaven, which arrive in heaven in Revelation 7, and then also the 144,000 Israelites, which are handpicked by God and receive the seal of God on their foreheads. That's kind of symbolically, I guess. But they remain on earth. And since there's two groups in Revelation 7, there has to be two groups in Matthew 24, 15 through 31. The two have to agree with one another. And this is the sixth seal rapture, when the Christians go to heaven, because the sun, moon, and stars are exactly the same as the sixth seal, when he's gathering his elect. So it says immediately after the distress in those days, but the distress is the distress caused by the abomination. It's identical to the sixth seal. Only it says that in the sixth seal it says there is a great earthquake, and then it talks about the sun, moon, and stars. So this is like immediately after the earthquake and the distress caused by the earthquake. You can tell that because, say, the earthquake of the sixth seal will cause a tsunami that heads toward Israel, and that's why Judea has to flee to the mountains, because that's what you naturally do when a tsunami is heading your way. You flee to the mountains, and you have to do it quickly. So like he said, no one on the roof go down and get anything out of his house, because you only have maybe 15 or 20 minutes to get to higher ground before the tsunami hits. So once the abomination is set up, then the earthquake happens. They have to flee to the mountains and prepare. It says, then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. That's because the sixth seal rapture and the tsunami that heads toward Israel. But it says immediately after that earthquake, when the sun, moon, and stars do their thing, that's when the rapture happens. And you have the Christians in heaven in Revelation 7. But you also have the other group in Revelation 7, which is the 144,000 Israelites that stay on the earth. But that's where Daniel 8 comes in, talking about the 1290 and 1335. It says, because if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. That's where you get the 1335. Because, see, they only have to avoid the mark of the beast for 45 days. But that's only for the sake of the elect. That's not for everyone. Everyone else has to endure the whole 3 years, and no one makes it. It says no one should survive if those, except for those who are martyred in Revelation 14 and 15. But it's only, it's clearly in Revelation 14 and 15, it's clearly only the 144,000. It says that. And it says, and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I've told you ahead of time. But the great signs and miracles from the false prophet, that's in the latter half of Revelation 13, when he sets up the mark of the beast. And so, that has to do with the 1290. when he sets up the mark of the beast. But see, the 144,000, they're not deceived. They don't take the mark of the beast, and that's why they're martyred at day 1335, which is why they're cut short before the bowl plagues. And then this section is just a transitional section, because he's transitioning from the Jews back to the Gentiles, so it kind of applies to both groups, but it's just a transitional section. But there's two groups, the Christians and the 144,000, just like the two groups in Revelation 7. But I wanted to point this out because the post-tribs, they try to make this all one group and say this is all sequential, which it's not. But in saying that it's sequential, they ignore the fact that there's two groups in Revelation 7. But that's not unusual, because they also ignore a lot in Revelation, because they admit that the sixth seal is the rapture because it matches. I mean, you can't deny it, because the sun, moon, and stars are exactly the same as the sixth seal, and this is the rapture. But they say that the sixth seal rapture is at the end, and in order to do that, they have to stack the seals, trumpets, and bowls all on top of one another, and they overlap them. But overlapping the seals, trumpets, and bowls is basically subtracting 2/3 of Revelation, all in order to get, the sixth seal at the end, like they want. And they do that because they're trying to take Matthew 24 in succession. But see, it wasn't meant to be, because if you look at verses 32 on, it's clearly not in succession, because it talks about the fig tree, and that's Israel, dating back to 1948. So it's definitely not in succession. But they insist on this 29 through 31 being in succession, but it's just not meant to be. And you can tell because of the two groups in Revelation 7. And there's a severe warning in Revelation 22:19 that says not to subtract from Revelation, or he will subtract heaven from you. And that's indicative of false prophets, because false prophets aren't going to go to heaven. And if you subtract from Revelation and change God's prophecy in Revelation, you're basically a false prophet. So you don't want to follow the post-tribs, because they're basically false prophets, because they insist on this being in succession, but in doing so, they subtract over half of Revelation. And they'll say they're not doing it, but they are. So don't believe them. They're false prophets. So in summary, Israel does not make a treaty with the Antichrist, neither before or after. Because like I say, the Antichrist most likely comes from Iran, and if you're holding your breath for Israel to make a treaty with Iran, then, I don't suggest you holding your breath that long, because it's not going to happen. Israel's not even going to make a treaty with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians insist on having East Jerusalem as their capital, and Israel's not going to split Jerusalem. That's just not going to happen. So don't hold your breath there either. The abomination is not set up in the third temple. It's just in that general area of Jerusalem. And I gave several scriptures that prove that. There's nothing that says the abomination is set up in the third temple. And the third temple is not built before the rapture. It's built while the two witnesses prophesy, which is during the trumpet plagues, which is after the rapture. Because they can't start the trumpet plagues until the seventh seal is done in Revelation 8. And you can look at Revelation 8 if you don't believe me. They can't start the trumpet plagues until after the seventh seal, and the sixth seal is the rapture. So obviously the sixth seal comes before the seventh seal. And I explain more of that in a video called End Times Explained. So you can look at that if you want more information. But in closing, all I say, always follow sound doctrine. That means the whole Bible. It says, for the time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. And that's exactly the time we're living in now, because with social media and everything, it's like people don't listen to facts. They don't listen to sound doctrine, because they can always gather a whole bunch of people around them to say what they want to hear. People only listen to other people who agree with them. They just don't put up with sound doctrine anymore. But sound doctrine, I'm giving sound doctrine because I started with the abomination, first and foremost from the book of Daniel, which Jesus clearly emphasized with great urgency in Matthew 24:15. So it was Jesus that said, go and study the abomination in the book of Daniel, but people didn't do that. People should always follow Jesus' instruction, because that's why others have gotten it wrong. Because the book of Daniel was difficult to figure out, and no one could figure out the abomination in the book of Daniel. For one thing, Daniel 11, it specifically says it's sealed until the time of the end. But God didn't say it would be sealed forever. It's actually been unsealed now and revealed in Daniel11truth.com. And it shows that we're heading toward the abomination, just like Jesus said. It's actually the next verse to happen. So I would suggest everyone get saved, because it's going to happen whether you like it or not. So, but anyway, for more information, you can go to Daniel11truth.com and praise Jesus.